I'm really delighted to be speaking here at, as Udayan said, the global launch of this book. So, my previous books have been published in, in different contexts, and have usually, the first event has been in Delhi. Now, I thought I should reverse it because not really in the spirit of South Indian chauvinism, though let's not discount that completely. I've lived in this city 30 years with my family. I have long-standing personal roots here. Both sets of grandparents were settled here. The cricket team I follow is the Friends Union Cricket Club, whose tie is the only tie I own. But I think there was also an intellectual reason. I began my journey as an environmental scholar at the suggestion of someone who was then a professor at the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore. His name was Jayanta Bandyopadhyay, and I was doing a PhD in Kolkata. And when he heard I had grown up in Uttarakhand, he suggested I write sociology of the Chipko movement. So without him, without a professor from Bangalore, I would never have ventured into this then largely uncharted terrain. Insofar as sociology and history went, because sociologists and historians didn't really look at environmental subjects. And then my kind of intellectual formation as an environmental scholar, quite a lot of it happened in Bangalore. And it's particularly fitting that Professor Harini Nagendra is here today, chairing this event, because it is at her alma mater, the Indian Institute of Science, at the place where she herself did her PhD, the Center for Ecological Sciences, but long before her, that I started understanding the complex interactions between nature and society, and learning from the scientists at the IISc. In fact, this book, in the acknowledgements, there are eight ecologists thanked. I mean, Harini is one of them, and 5 of the other 8, so 6 in all, have an allegiance to CES and IISc. So, in a sense, it's also a repayment of an intellectual debt, because I could never have come to grips with the complex, multifaceted relationship between human beings and the natural environment in the context of India, particularly, had it not been for the months and years I spent with the scientists at the Center for Ecological Sciences at the IISc. Bangalore, since then, has also become the epicenter of ecological research beyond the IISc. The outstanding institutions like ATRI, like her own Azim Premji University, like the Nature Conservation Foundation, which also has at least one leg here. So this book, in a sense, began, elements of it began in Bangalore many decades ago. Now, last year, 2023, marked the 50th anniversary of the Chipko movement. Now, the environmental scholars of my generation were really children of Chipko. My own first book happened to be a sociology and history of the Chipko movement. But what Chipko did was to decisively refute the belief that India was too poor to be green. It also showed a way, which was then quite original and striking, of combining a concern for environmental sustainability with a concern for social justice. Chipko was a struggle of the little man, the little woman, and indeed sometimes the little child, against the rapacious exploitation of the Himalayan resources by urban industrial interests. So there was inbuilt in Chipko an element of social justice, but of course it had a larger vision of how to restore the ravaged ecosystem of the Himalaya, how to bring about a pattern of economic development that would not merely mimic the Western model of energy-intensive, capital-intensive, resource-intensive growth, but chart its own path, consistent with the higher population densities, the more fragile ecologies that our country had and still has. The environmental debate that Chipko spawned carried on through the 70s and 80s. It was responsible for the first acknowledgement by the government that it needed a department, then a ministry of the environment. It sparked research in the academy, by sociologists, historians, economists, ecologists, hydrologists on environmental matters. Chipko also spawned a breed of outstanding environmental journalists. So I was part of that generation, who I like to think of as the children of Chipko. So this intense burst of activity, creative activity in the environmental field, petered out, started in the 1970s and petered out by the 1990s and beyond, partly because of economic liberalization, which on balance was a good thing. I mean, we can talk maybe in the Q&A about what was valuable and worthy about economic liberalization. It nurtured a new generation of entrepreneurs. It broke the stifling control of the state over the economy. It made a dent in poverty, massive dent in poverty. But it was even less mindful of environmental constraints than public sector industrialization had been. And there was a time when India was embracing economic liberalization with great enthusiasm, that the cheerleaders and the champions of economic liberalization invariably portrayed environmentalists as villains, because they were the only one asking tough questions about where a mine was sited. What would happen if a new chemical plant would pollute the environment? How could you grow our cities without extracting and sometimes brutalizing the resources of the countryside? So there was, in the 90s and 2000s, what I like to think of as an anti-environmental backlash. And then environmentalism was reborn through the climate change crisis, which brought, you could say, the mortality of the human race very much into our consciousness. And the young people here, I would see them as grandchildren of Chipko, children of the climate debate, whereas maybe, I'm one of the elderly children of Chipko, and Harini is somewhat in the same generation, but just a few years younger. But again, she started her work before really climate change became recognized as one of the most fundamental challenges facing humanity. Now, so Chipko started 50 years ago, but though it was an important founding moment in the history of environmentalism, there is a forgotten prehistory of environmentalism, which goes back to the 19th century and which is really the subject of this book that I'm going to speak about today, Speaking with Nature, The Origins of Indian Environmentalism. What my book does is that it excavates the work of 10 thinkers, who they are named, who in different ways spoke insightfully and often presciently about human relations with nature. These were environmentalists not just before climate change, but environmentalists before Chipko. Now, I wrote my first book on the Chipko movement, which I like to think of as an example of environmentalism from below, or to use the jargon fashionable when I was starting out as an environmental scholar, as an illustration of subaltern environmentalism. In the course of my research, particularly in American libraries, I discovered that there was a comparable history from above that preceded Chipko. I stumbled upon the works, actually in the library of Yale University, where I was spending a year. I stumbled upon the works of the Gandhian economist J.C. Kumarappa and the Lucknow sociologist Radhakamal Mukerjee, who were writing about, in a recognizably ecological language, about the kind of alternate path to development that India needed to forge. And this is in the 1920s and 30s. And I stumbled upon their writings, and I thought maybe there is a complementary book to be written here, which would trace an intellectual genealogy of Indian environmentalism. A little later, I discovered Patrick Geddes, the visionary town planner. I had always been interested in Verrier Elwin, who is also one of the individuals who features in this book, who talked about an anthropologist who documented with great detail and considerable empathy the bond between Adivasis and forests. And I wrote a preliminary essay in the Economic and Political Weekly in the 1990s, featuring 4 or 5 of these thinkers, and I gave that essay the title, The Prehistory of Indian Environmentalism, Intellectual Traditions. So these were intellectual traditions, not activist community traditions of the Chipko kind. And I was absolutely focused on writing a book on these 4, 5, 6 thinkers I discovered till that moment. When a publisher from London landed at my doorstep and said, why don't you write a history of independent India? Which was not something that had ever struck me. I thought it's beyond my ken. I could never have conceived of a project so reckless and ambitious as writing the history of my whole country, politics, economics, sociology, the works, law, the works. But when I started thinking about it, the project excited me. It took a decade to complete. Meanwhile, I got interested in Mahatma Gandhi, and settling my accounts with Gandhi took another decade. And 2 decades had passed, and I thought, actually, I will never write my prehistory of Indian environmentalism. But then the pandemic happened. Now, one of the things, the pandemic affected all of you in a variety of different ways, which you all remember, mostly with pain, but sometimes maybe with also some happiness, because it allowed you to do things you couldn't do in the kind of frenetic business of your daily life. But for me, the most important consequence of the pandemic was that I could not visit the archives. Now, for a historian, the archives are a drug. Ever since I moved to Bangalore in 1995, I would spend 3 months a year, sometimes 4 months a year, in tranches of 2-3 weeks each, working in the archives in Delhi, Bombay, Ahmedabad, London, Pretoria, Haifa in Israel, wherever my research and my curiosity took me. And here I was, the pandemic had come, and I was, like all of you, confined to my study. And I decided, let me see what I already have. And I opened a cupboard, I took out my notebooks, I opened another cupboard, I found some faded Xeroxes. I looked at an antiquated bookshelf of mine, and there was a whole pile of pamphlets by these curious scholars written in the 20s and 30s, including some of Geddes' town plans. And I said, maybe I can return to that project 20 years after I abandoned it. It required a little more work. I had identified a few more thinkers along the way. In some ways, perhaps the delay was fortuitous, because in the 20 years I had been away from environmental research, I had learned a great deal more about my country, about its politics, its society, its legal system, its evolution from its colonial past to its post-colonial present. And I thought I had the makings of a book, which is what I then wrote, which is here before you. So, the book profiles 10 thinkers. Let me tell you a little bit about some of them. I'll summarize or introduce you to what is intriguing, fascinating, distinctive, and indeed contemporary about some of these thinkers. And there's much more, of course, in the book itself. So the book starts with a chapter on Rabindranath Tagore, who is a kind of maybe an unlikely subject with which to begin this book. But if you read the chapter, I think at the end I would have convinced the reader that he belongs absolutely centrally in the history of Indian environmentalism. And among the reasons that Tagore has not been seen really closely in this light is that there was so much more about him. As you know, he transformed the Bengali language. He was the first Asian to win a Nobel Prize in any discipline. He was a poet, a playwright, a songster, an artist, an institutional builder, an inspiration to Gandhi, Tagore, Subhash Bose. And along with all of this, he was also, as the chapter title of my book says, also a myriad-minded environmentalist. And what I argue about Tagore is that his environmentalism had at least 4 distinct dimensions which you could say blended into one another. The first dimension, some of you who read Tagore, and Udayan certainly, would have already been aware of. The aesthetic dimension of his environmentalism. You know, his fine-grained descriptions of trees, of rivers, of mountains, in his poetry and his prose. You know, there's an entire collection of poems set in the forest. They are the letters he wrote to his niece while he is traveling through eastern Bengal, describing the glories of the landscape. There's, of course, his accounts of his first journeys to the Himalaya. But well beyond India, because Tagore was a true internationalist, you will find in his travelogues really evocative descriptions of natural beauty. When he's writing about Persia, when he's writing about Bali, when he's writing about his first trip to the Alps and so on. So there's the aesthetic dimension, but this is merely one of the dimensions of Tagore's environmentalism. A second dimension is the educational. I was reading while researching this book, a collection of essays by the well-known Canadian novelist Margaret Atwood, who has a deep sensitivity to nature. And she writes in these essays, when I was young, it's a great shame we had nothing called environmental education. I know children who went to school were never brought face to face with nature in its beauty and its diversity. They just learned in the classroom and the laboratory. Well, that may have been the case in Canada and in most parts of India, but not in Birbhum district, where Tagore, in his school and his college, in Patha Bhavan and in Shantiniketan, had made relationship with nature, understanding with nature in all its diversity, integral to its educational philosophy. So there's the aesthetic dimension, there's the educational dimension, and there's the political dimension of Tagore's environmentalism. In my book, I quote a long passage where Tagore talks about British imperialism as a system not merely of political domination and economic exploitation, but also of ecological devastation. He says Western imperialism, I'm quoting from memory, he says Western imperialism is cannibalistic. It feeds on the lands, the resources, and the people of other countries and cultures. So now, the argument that Western imperialism had an ecological dimension to it. It was exploitative of the natural endowments of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. This is well established in the literature. But Tagore was not a scholar, he was not working in the archives, but in his tract Nationalism, published in 1917, recognizes this. So that's where I start with Tagore and the many aspects, many different dimensions of his environmentalism. Now, the book begins with an epigraph from Gandhi. And I was about the dangers of blindly imitating Western models of industrialization. Gandhi says in 1928 that if we follow this path, we will strip the world bare like locusts. 1928. And it looks like now India and China will together strip the world bare like locusts. But I don't have a chapter on Gandhi, merely an epigraph. I have chapters on 2 of Gandhi's extraordinary disciples, one of whom was an English woman called Madeline Slade, Mira, whose aspects of whose life are very well known to Indians. You know, this kind of very resonant, symbolically resonant story of a white woman, daughter of a British admiral, abandoning her life of wealth and privilege and falling at the feet of the Mahatma and saying, I will be your daughter till the end of life. And this narrative of the devotion and adoration of a white woman to a wealthy white woman to a skinny and poor brown man has been memorialized in Attenborough's movie, but is also the subject of a Amar Chitra Katha comic on Miraben. But her life was actually much more interesting than this. As I discovered, she was with Gandhi and served him and went to prison with him and peeled his oranges and watched and documented his bowel movements, and she did all of that from 1926 when she reaches Ahmedabad right up till 1945 when she and Gandhi are released from the prison, 1944. But then she leaves Gandhi. She wants to break free of her Mahatma, her mentor, her master, and she goes to the Himalaya and spends 15 years working with peasants on really what we now recognize as environmental sustainability. So she writes of the dangers of chemical agriculture, the excessive use of chemical fertilizer. Instead, she promotes organic manure. She's an early critic of large dams. And above all, she is 2 decades before Chipko, she writes about how the forest landscape of the Himalaya, which was once diverse, is being made monocultural. That due to the commercial greed of the forest department, the oak forests, which are much more important to sustaining the water cycle and impeding soil erosion, are being replaced by cheer pine, and what implications this has for the environment and for floods and so on. So Mira has a full chapter in my book, and I'm going to quote you one passage from Mira's writings. This is from an article she wrote in 1949 in an Indian newspaper. And it's about how the rapidity of ecological change was a feature of modern life. And here's the quote, I quote, "The tragedy today is that educated and moneyed classes are altogether out of touch with our Mother Earth and the animal and vegetable population which she sustains. The world of nature's planning is ruthlessly plundered, despoiled, and disorganized by man. By his science and machinery, he may get huge returns for a time, but ultimately will come desolation. We have to study nature's balance and develop our lives within her laws if we are to survive as a physically healthy and morally decent species." This is Mira Ben in 1949, long before the Center for Ecological Sciences in IISc was set up. So Mira was a poet, I beg your pardon, Tagore was a poet, Mira was an activist. A third figure in my book was a university professor. And as a sometime university professor myself, speaking alongside a serving university professor, I thought trade union solidarity called for having at least one paid-up academic among this pantheon of 10 pioneers. This university professor was called Radhakamal Mukerjee. Like me, he started in economics and then moved to sociology. Perhaps because like me, his maths was not good enough, but I can't say for sure. But then he became a pioneer of interdisciplinary research. He taught in Lucknow University for several decades and wrote some really important books on what he called social ecology, a philosophical intellectual framework that would integrate the natural sciences and the social sciences. Now there's a great deal of talk about interwoven approach to learning, but Mukerjee is writing about this in the 20s and 30s from a philosophical, theoretical, intellectual point of view. But he also has a strongly practical side. And he's doing fieldwork in the Indo-Gangetic plain, and he's writing about the vital importance to rural life, to agriculture, of community resources, community management of resources. Forests, pasture, tanks, irrigation channels, how previously village communities took collective responsibility in managing these resources sustainably, and how the community spirit had broken down, state control had undermined it. And again, he's an absolute pioneer. The whole scholarly debate about common property resources and their vital importance to agriculture really blossomed in the 1980s and beyond. In India through the work of N.S. Jodha, overseas through the work of Eleanor Ostrom, whom Harini knew well, a Nobel laureate in economics. But Mukerjee, in his own way, maybe not using the sophisticated language that later scholars would use, but using his empirical understanding of the deep interconnections between the land, the water, the pasture, the soil, and the forest, was writing about the importance of common property resources. So that's Mukerjee, a university professor. Then I have a chapter on this extraordinary couple, Albert and Gabrielle Howard, who are scientists working in the imperial system, in the Imperial Agricultural Research Institute, are disenchanted by the narrow specialization and fragmentation of modern agricultural science, are dismayed by the arrogance of the colonial state towards ordinary kisans, leave the employ of the British government start their own institute in Indore, funded by the Maharaja, and are real pioneers of ecological, sustainable agriculture. And are recognized as such across the world, though they have been largely forgotten in India. Now, the Howards were European scientists who worked in India, and so was another figure in my book, the Scottish ecologist Patrick Geddes. Now, Geddes is distinctive in my book in that his sphere of activity is the city. Verrier Elwin is looking at the forest. The Howards are looking at the farm. Tagore is looking at the village. Because their interest is really in where the bulk of the Indian population resides. These are environmentalists who want to make, early environmentalists, who want to make rural life more habitable, more sustainable, more egalitarian, more inclusive, following the Gandhi's dictum that India lives in her villages. But Geddes said India actually also lives in her cities. I mean, this is a civilization with a very ancient urban culture. With industrialization will come urbanization. There'll be more cities, larger cities, more crowded cities, and we have to really think about how to organize life in those cities in a more ecologically sustainable and more inclusive way. Now, Geddes is again, all these characters are actually utterly fascinating if you look at their biographies. So, Geddes comes to India when he's 60, having already established himself as a town planner in Scotland and Europe. And he comes to India to show an exhibition of his work, to take an exhibition of his work on cities in history across India. Except that he leaves in 1914, the war breaks out, the First World War breaks out, his exhibition is on the next ship, and that ship is sunk by a German destroyer, and his life's work goes down with it. But resolute, a scholar, he says, I'll look for new opportunities, and instead of taking his exhibition around India, he actually studies Indian cities and writes 24 town plans about them. Lahore, Thane, Kolkata, Dhaka, Tanjavur. And from these town plans, I've tried to excavate his philosophy of town planning, which very briefly, I summarize as 3 maxims: respect for nature, respect for democracy, and respect for heritage conservation. My book starts with Tagore and ends chronologically, because Tagore is really writing from the 1880s, and ends with a chapter on a campaigning journalist, someone whom at least those of my generation in this room would know by name. He was called M. Krishnan. He was born in 1912 in Chennai, then Madras, and he had an itinerant career. He was a printmaker, a teacher, a freelance journalist, till the Statesman of Kolkata gave him a regular column in 1952, a fortnightly column called Country Notebook, which he ran for 46 years. And I grew up in Dehradun, where my father subscribed to the Delhi edition of the Statesman, because as he said, he was scrupulous about matters of grammar, and he said, among all Indian newspapers, it has the fewest misprints. So that's how I got to read Krishnan. And he was a master stylist, and a fabulous naturalist. He had been to every wild part of India, not just large, gorgeous forests, but shrub-jungle, deserts, wetlands, the coast, and he had written about these landscapes with great sensitivity, insight, and elegance. He was also a fabulous photographer, by the way, but his photography I don't really talk about in my book. Now, Krishnan wrote beautifully, as I said, and more importantly, the reason I've included him in my book is that he was interested in all aspects of nature. He was not a specialist. I thought of, when you write a work of history, there's always a question of inclusion and exclusion. Who do you select and whom do you finally, often reluctantly, discard? And for me, the choice in the sphere of wildlife was between Salim Ali and Krishnan. And while Salim Ali was undoubtedly the greatest scientist, Krishnan had a much more diverse and varied, you could say, portfolio, because he wrote about everything. He just didn't write about birds like Salim Ali, nor did he simply write about tigers like Jim Corbett did. Krishnan was also an ecological patriot. He ferociously opposed exotic species. And Professor Madhav Gadgil, who is by way of being a mentor to both Harini and myself, told me a story of Krishnan visiting the Indian Institute of Science, which, as you know, so far, I don't know what's happening with all the building there now, but so far is one of the most beautiful of our university campuses. And the tababuya was in bloom when Krishnan went to speak there. At a reception afterwards, the director asked him with some pride, "Mr. Krishnan, what do you think of our campus?" He said, "Dreadful. Uproot all the exotics and plant native species." So Krishnan's work was one of documentation and exhortation. He believed that the saving of our wildlife is a race against time. He argued, I quote, that he hoped that Indians now living can assure to our future generations a joy and a pride in the country's great heritage of nature, one of the most deeply satisfying things that life in India has to offer to the people. So there are these 10 characters in my book. I've given you just glimpses of 4 or 5 of them. My work is really a contribution to intellectual history. It's not a work of prescription, nor is it a work of advocacy. But it may nonetheless provide readers some pointers to the present. The environmental pioneers I write about worked across many different domains: the wild, the forest, the farm, the waters, the grasslands, the city. Their ideas can help us understand, even if not tackle, the multi-dimensional environmental challenges we face, which are scarcely restricted to climate change. I've been saying this for some time, and allow me to say it again, that even if climate change did not exist, India would be an environmental basket case. The air pollution in Delhi and northern India's cities has nothing to do with climate change. The death of our rivers had nothing to do with climate change. The depletion of our groundwater aquifers has nothing to do with climate change. The chemical contamination of our soil has nothing to do with climate change. The degradation of our forests by the invasion of weeds has nothing to do with climate change. And all these problems collectively impact hundreds of millions of Indians adversely, and mostly poor working class Indians, because the elite, including many people in this room, have found ways to insulate themselves from the consequences of environmental devastation. So I hope my book, can reignite a conversation that takes environmentalism beyond climate change and environmentalism beyond the aesthetic concern for pretty trees and tigers to concerns of livelihood, social justice, equity, access, democratic decision-making, and so on. My book is a work of, it's about 10 writers, so naturally it pays close attention to what these writers said and how and why they wrote and argued as they did. So I've got to end my lecture today with a prophetic quote from one writer, the first exemplar in my book, Rabindranath Tagore. And these remarks I'm going to read to you come from a lecture he gave in Sri Niketan, the agricultural institute he founded as a counterpart to Shanti Niketan in 1922. In his remarks, Tagore said, I quote, "Civilization today," this is 1922, "caters for a whole population of gluttons, and intemperance, which could safely have been tolerated in a few, has spread its contagion to the multitude. The city represents energy and materials concentrated for the satisfaction of an exaggerated appetite, and this concentration, this exaggerated appetite, is considered a symptom of civilization." In this lecture in Sri Niketan, Tagore offered a parable of environmental destruction. He imagined that on the moon, a new race of beings was born, a new race that began greedily to devour its own surroundings. And his parable continued, and I quote, "Through machinery of tremendous power, this new race of beings made such an addition to their natural capacity that their career of plunder entirely outstripped nature's power for recuperation. These profit makers dug big holes in the storied capital of the planet. They created wants which were unnatural, and provision for these wants was forcibly extracted from nature. When they had reduced the limited store of material in their surroundings, they proceeded to wage furious wars among their different tribes, each wanting his special share of the lion's share, each special allotment of the lion's share. In their scramble for the right of self-indulgence, they took it as a sign of superiority to be ruthless in the satisfaction of their desires. They exhausted the water, cut down the trees, reduced the surface of the earth to a desert, riddled with enormous pits, and made its interior a rifled pocket emptied of its valuables." I'll read this last line again about this imaginary race of beings. "They exhausted the water, cut down the trees, reduced the surface of the planet to a desert, riddled with enormous pits, and made its interior a rifled pocket emptied of its valuables." Now, this is not an imaginary race of human beings. This describes India and the world today, 100 years later. Thank you.
Thank you, Ram. And I should say, for me, it's been a personal pleasure to read this book. If you remember, sometime before the pandemic, I was telling you that as a teacher, we are always looking for literature on Indian paths to environmentalism to teach in the classroom. And I think there are many young people in the audience who know that it's very hard to find such literature. In fact, we go back to some of your early writings and also with Madhav, so I want to pick up on that a little bit. So it's really nice to see this out, because I think this has been long coming, and I'm glad, even if the other fallouts of the pandemic, given them, but I'm glad that this was one thing that came out. I want to start with, path-breaking two books that you wrote with Madhav, which is Ecology, Inequity, This We Shall Land to begin with, and which are still taught so widely in classrooms across India, but which have been challenged also in many ways. Would you say that this book draws on that framing, is very different in framing? How have things evolved as you've been, like you say, your canvas has broadened over the past several decades?
No, I think, the influence of those years working with Madhav Gadgil is also manifest in this book. So, I mean, there's several things about Madhav Gadgil which you know of, but many people in the audience don't. He is an ecologist with an extraordinary love and capacity for fieldwork. He's now 82. In his late 70s, he was doing fieldwork in Gadchiroli and Goa. And that's because he likes fieldwork, but also because he knows the extraordinary social and ecological diversity of India. That is what makes India unmatched. He also has an immensely pragmatic streak. He may complain about this book that there's not enough advocacy. I'm not shown a way out. But I'm a mere historian. I mean, I can only warn, I can't prescribe. But he was also incredibly interdisciplinary. And also, I think, the ability to learn from different people, right? So, yes, I mean, I think the impress of working with people like Madhav and many others. I mean, as I said, I talked about the ecologists I thank in the book. But I also thank economists, I thank activists, I thank journalists. And it's really, it's the journey, environmental journey that I commenced 4 decades ago, which was interrupted for a decade and a half maybe, but I always had some curiosity about what was going on, even though I think it informs all of this. And I think one of the nice things, it just happened that I had found these 10 people. There could have been 8, there could have been 12. One of the interesting things is, which I'm happy about, is that in their work, in their life, in their travels, they reflect and embody the diversity of India, the spatial scale and the ecological and cultural diversity. And one last thing I'd say, which I should have said maybe in my talk. This book has 5 foreigners. and it's published at a time when at a time of intense xenophobia, when we are told India has nothing to learn from the world, but India has everything to teach the world. Now, I'm still wondering what India has to teach the world, but that's a separate issue. But, and even the Indians traveled around. I mean, people like Tagore and Kumarappa, who's here, and Radhakamal Mukerjee. So at the same time, I hope it also informs, at the same time, it asks Indians to be less insular. But it also asks European and American scholars to be less insular, because they think that they're icons. I quote early in the book an American environmental writer who says basically Muir and Thoreau and Leopold can teach us whatever is to be known about the environmental predicament. So I think both within India and outside, I think it reflects this diversity, this inclusiveness. And maybe if I had not spent those years with people like Madhav, I would not have developed this kind of more broad-minded understanding.
Thanks. And I also think what your book points us to is the fact that there was so much going on in the 19th and early 20th centuries that the world was in many ways a much smaller place. We tend to think of globalization, interconnection now, but people were traveling everywhere and talking to each other. I mean, I was looking at something completely different, but I was looking at Indian women involved in the suffrage movement in the 1920s. They were talking to Sri Lanka, the UK, and the US and learning back and forth and thinking out what would an Indian woman's path to asking for suffrage be. And they didn't want the Western path, but they wanted to learn elements. So I think there's a lot of synergies with multiple things. Yeah. So a second question, again, from a teaching point of view, and then I'll get into a few other things. I think one of the frustrations I have when teaching is we're often told when you talk about framing the environment that there's an anthropocentric view, which is, of course, the Western view, and the biocentric view, which is then the deep ecology, the whales. To me, Indian environmentalism doesn't fit in either of these two baskets.
No, I think that dichotomy is misleading, unhelpful, and it's used only to give yourself a certificate or moral superiority. You are anthropocentric, I am biocentric. You only think of humans, I think of everyone, all forms of creation. So I've always been uncomfortable with that.
And to me, the Indian path, in some sense, is a kin relationship with nature. It's a kin relationship with nature. It's neither that you're anthropocentric nor that you're biocentric, but that you're one with nature, right? All these, Tagore's description.
In fact, that's why I call this book Speaking with Nature. Not speaking for nature. Krishnan maybe is the one exception in speaking for nature, but the others are speaking with nature. So the kin, what you say, is the kinship.
Which is a very important point, and that comes through a lot. Now, I'll come again because there are a lot of younger people in the audience. To me, you start with your description of Radhakamal Mukerjee and J.C. Kumarappa, and you say they're relatively unknown outside India, and yet you discovered them in Yale in the Yale archives. Right? And this is so characteristic of someone trying to do archival research in India that you have the Indian archives, you have spent a lot of time, as you said, in Bombay and Pune and Bangalore and Delhi, but there's such a hit and miss. You might find something, you might not. And the reality is that someone who wants to work on India often has to spend time outside India in the archives. So where would younger people who may not have the chance to travel outside India, how should they start something like this? Because I think your book gives a lot of, to me, pointers where other people now need to go off and do similar research on other things.
Absolutely. So I think, they used to be, at least when I was younger, reasonably well-equipped libraries in India with old documents. The National Library in Calcutta would be one place. But yes, there's a wonderful internet resource which is temporarily down. I hope it's restored, the Internet Archive, where you can get out-of-print books from elsewhere. I'd also say for me, because I couldn't travel abroad all the time. But whenever I could, I made sure I'd make a detour via the British Library or somewhere where I would have a week, in a really good library. The tip I would give younger researchers, it worked for me. I hope it'll work. It may or may not work for you. Is that there's a tendency to find a document in a library and furiously photograph everything, which means it'll be in your archive, in your hard disk, and you may never read it. I find it much better when you find a rare, interesting document to sit and take notes. You assimilate it better. You can link it to the other documents you've found. You can integrate it with your overall conception of what your frame is. So I think that's one thing. The other thing is, second-hand bookstores. When I was younger, Select Bookshop in Bangalore, Prabhu Book Service in Gurgaon, they provided me fabulous stuff. And you may still, young people here, you're lucky you're in Bangalore because you have Blossom and Bookworm, right? Okay, so you'll find rare things. But yes, it is true that if you're working on modern India, which is like 19th, 20th century India. The British Library is an invaluable resource. Some
And
of
also now down because it got hacked.
it also got hacked.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah.
No, this is, I think, very useful because I was looking at this and thinking so many people would look at this and to me the possibilities this opens, which is what this visual land opened, is for more and more people to get into this field and to uncover these details.
I'll also say that, essentially this project started when I discovered these documents in the Yale University Library, 86, 87. So almost 40 years, right? Not full time. But sometimes projects mature slowly, So I think that is something which one must be prepared for the long haul. I mean, it's really, I think maybe like you and me, in a sense we've been lucky in that we had a PhD, right? Because a PhD teaches you to be patient, to be there for several years. At the 4th year, to ask for an extension for your 5th year, to wait till your guide reads your chapters. After the guide has read your chapters, to wait till the external advisor reads your chapters. Right? So I think having a PhD sometimes is good training for being patient and for conceiving of. You would agree, I think. Yeah.
I would, and it also fits into the classic Indian capacity to adjust.
Yeah,
but sometimes we adjust too much. So, yes. So another question. You have, and as you yourself said, only 2 women.
Yeah.
And the 2 women are not Indian by origin.
That's it, yeah.
And this is also, also an issue that you have one person who wrote on tribes, maybe very few people who looked at caste, none from a tribe themselves, none from a caste themselves. True, and that is really a challenge of what's available.
No, that is not, it's partly a challenge of what's available. It's partly a product of the times. That, you spoke of the suffrage movement. Look, now, the Indian suffrage movement is really from the 1920s, so there's the All India Women's Conference, there are iconic people like Sarojini Naidu and Kamala Devi. Now, this is a time where women are getting into the public sphere in activism. And that's been a long and arduous battle. And they're still in the public sphere. But intellectual work, as we said, requires privacy, requires time. So, so the climate of the time was hostile to independent Indian women writers and intellectuals. You wouldn't get a PhD score. So in a sense, this is the absence of women, that there are only 2 women, is a product of that time. It's the fact that, probably the only non-elite Indian in it is J.C. Kumarappa. I mean, you might know, but he was, I think he was probably born in an OBC background. He was a Tamil who then converted. But I think that was a time when intellectual work was largely the privilege of men, of an upper caste man. But, I think this is an important but. I think we judge a writer partly by how much privilege he or she has enjoyed. And also, in all honesty, partly by how much of a empathy and a capacity do they have to go beyond that privilege and imagine, document, and write with empathy about lives of those who are not privileged. Like if, Kumarappa wrote about villagers, or Verrier Elwin wrote about Adivasis, or Mira wrote about the Himalayan peasant. Now, she wasn't just writing about her own folk. But in the 1920s, they could only have been Gabrielle Howard, who was a European female scientist in India. They couldn't have been an Indian woman scientist. Harini Nagendra could not have existed in 1920, right? So that is the limitation of the time. That's inescapable.
It is a limit. I'm just wondering if there are, again, people who wanted to build on this and, let's say, go beyond these archives. What else would they do? So in some sense, you could do oral histories, just stretching it to the 1920s. You could do poems, songs, other...
No, I think you could do many things.
What could you do?
So mine, as I said, mine is the intellectual history.
Yes.
It's the history from above.
Right.
I say early on in this book that my work largely deals with non-fiction writings. Right. It deals with scientific treatises, journalism, pamphlets. But, there is a tradition of literary writing by poets about nature, ecology in Bengal, in Kerala, in this, I don't know Kannada, but in this state.
Mahashweta Devi.
Mahashweta Devi, but in this state, people like Purnchandra Tejasvi and Carson and so on. So that could be one, kind of a more on the eco-critical, eco-literature line. But also maybe, looking at some of the folklorish studies. If you look at the folklore, which goes back, they're from the 19th century onwards, people documenting how rural and forest communities and sometimes even fishing communities interacted with nature, understand nature, broke down nature. So there are ways, I think, in which you can go beyond this.
Yeah, I mean, again, this was a question more for the younger people in the audience, because I am really looking at this book and thinking 20 years from now, 30 years from now, what will people look at this book and say, what did this spark? And I'm sure it will spark a lot.
And I think every work of history is an intervention in a conversation.
Absolutely.
It takes the conversation one step forward, but somebody else will take it 2 steps, 3 steps forward. Somebody else will confute your hypotheses, amend them, refine them, reject them. That is what history is about. So as long as no historian should ever be in the illusion that his or her work is definitive. Not at all. It's it's an intervention in a scholarly conversation. And if it's based on deep research, on some careful thinking, it may advance the conversation a little bit.
And this is an intervention in a specifically very spare and barren landscape. So that is why it is so important. So I have a couple of more questions, and then I'll open it up. I know audience have a lot of questions, and I know BIC has a hard cutoff at 8. You talk about interdisciplinary, Radhakamal Mukerjee being one part of it, but also the couple, Albert and Gabrielle Howard. So if you're looking at them, they're what one would call a type of transdisciplinarity. Action and theory.
That's right, yeah.
Right? And so when we're thinking of India moving ahead, at a time when the world is getting more disciplinary, academia is getting more disciplinary in one sense, but there are more liberal studies courses, and students, young people have the opportunity for more transdisciplinary thinking, more of breaking down between the field and the lab and the academic workplace. So what kind of pathways do you see forward? I mean, we are really looking to the past, not to get direct lessons or simplistic lessons for the future, but India is going into a time of great change, and there is climate change, there's pollution, there is the environmental catastrophes we see around us. What lessons could this book take us forward to?
No, I think ecology is in some ways the most naturally interdisciplinary of the sciences, because even within the natural sciences, you have physics, you have chemistry, you have biology, you have atmospheric sciences, you have soil, you have hydrology, and then you also have, botany, zoology, and then also, since it's about human beings, you to understand political systems, law, culture, technologies. So I'd say, in terms of intellectual challenge, I mean, for young people here, you will never get a Nobel Prize in ecology because it's not specialized enough. You have to break down something in very minute parts and invent something, very particular to get a Nobel Prize, or even maybe other kinds of prizes. But the intellectual thrill of working across domains, and in some ways, I feel that so I think that and it is also linked to real life crises today, right? I think and I think in some ways the Indian system, at least when I was younger, was excessively compartmentalized. I did science in high school, but then I never studied science after that. I did economics as a BA, but I didn't learn about history and political science while I was doing my BA. I think now there have been changes, even in the public university system, not just in the good new private universities, which have made this kind of interaction across disciplines easier. And what this means is that I could only have become an environmental science researcher had I because I had the anchoring and the support and the hand-holding of scientists who understood it. Today you will find a historian will on his own pick up some of these complexities. I think they're more daring that way.
They're more daring, and the opportunities. I mean, I will forever be grateful to Madhav because I did my undergraduate degree in microbiology and my master's in molecular biology. Only Madhav would have taken me on. And otherwise I would have been stuck the rest of my career being a microbiologist, which I would have hated. So, my last question for you before we open it up to the audience is, one of the things that affected me most profoundly while reading these books is even then, 1920s, 1880s, 1850s, and of course Krishnan being the most recent of them, they're talking about landscapes that are vanishing before their eyes. Even Tagore is talking about vanishing landscapes. A deep sense of ecological grief. How did you feel when you were documenting these? And looking at it now, what is your sense of hope for the future? Because one must have some hope for the future.
Yeah, that's when you pose that question, Harini, personally, I mean, I also have a sense of ecological grief, which is why I don't like going back to my hometown, Dehradun. Right. So, I mean, which has been vandalized in a way in which, you know, and even not just the ecology, but even the lifestyle, the farming culture, and all that. So, yes, I mean, that is something which, you know, it's sometimes it's inevitable with a larger population density, economic growth, consumption. But I think, yeah, it's a very tough question. I mean, it's the political system is biased against ecological restoration. It's also biased against solving tangible problems that affect real people, like the Delhi air pollution thing, right? Yeah, I mean, it's, but there is work in, I mean, at the same time, there are young people in the field. I mean, for example, in the Nilgiris, you do have groups working in ecological restoration, you know, and including, you know, trying to use lantana in a more interesting, productive way, so you remove it, but then generate income. So, I mean, it's a challenging field, but it's also at the same time a very exciting and, you know, a vital field for our future. Yeah.
Absolutely. So with that, and speaking of vital fields for our future, I think we can open it up to questions. Someone is there with a mic? Sandhya, you're there.
Ram, brilliant. Really welcome back to the, it's a pleasure to have you back writing about the environment after so many years. One, a comment, and then a kind of effort to get you to reflect. The first comment, if you look at it, none of these 10, and I got a chance to read the book and all chapters of it, none of them are card-carrying environmental thinkers, right? Yeah. Which is the comment that you also made. Yeah. And which to me, interestingly, alludes to the need to sort of, and the other part was the materiality of the environment all of them reflect on. Yeah. Both of which we've seemed to have lost the connection to. The fact that the environment and ecology undergirds most of it. And economists particularly, are, except the specialized breed of ecological economists, have lost the fact that we actually live on a finite planet with finite physical resources. And all of the thinkers in one form, shape or the other are alluding to that part. So it almost seems to me that there is something in this to be retrieved in terms of our relationship as societies to the environment. So that was the comment part. The other part is when you look at all these, they seem like a very disparate set of people. But if I were to push you to try and trace an arc through them for a rejuvenated sort of environmental politics, what would the sort of contours of that politics be? You of alluded to.
No, that. I think, see, there's inevitably, on your first part, you know, that there's inevitably a question of selectivity and personal bias. I mean, these are 10 that appeal to me. Okay. I think each is interesting and original, as you point out. And they also represent different facets. They worked in different parts of India, on different natural ecological landscapes, with different groups of people, had different writing styles. You know, some are more scholarly, some are more exhortative. But they probably brought together, I mean, the writer's artifice is bringing them together. I mean, maybe they won't figure any, these 10 would not be there in, you know, any other all-time 10 or 11. Actually, one of the interesting people in the book is K.M. Munshi, who I call the first Hindutva environmentalist. K.M. Munshi is like Tagore in some ways. Very well known for other things. As a novelist in Gujarati, as a lawyer, as a constitution maker. But in his brief period as Minister of Agriculture in charge of forests, he discovered that forests were, could be integrated into his view of the ancient Hindu wisdom and Hindu spirituality. And he started this festival called Vana Mahotsav. And it's very interesting to discover him because he's also not been written about it in this context. So, you know, it's, I said, it may be a mark of age. If I had written this book 30 years ago, there would have been a concluding chapter answering your question. How can these 10 thinkers help us imagine a new environmental politics? Now at 67, somebody else has to imagine the politics. I have to write more books.
So Ram, thanks for the wonderful, I actually got a copy of the book yesterday in the airport. And I just noticed today that you're speaking here. I'm just picking off on what Harini and you know, the end of it, you know, about the ecological grief, right? And I've also seen, you know, this comment on the speaking for nature, right? Huh? Speaking for nature, you picked on, you know, Krishnan. And I'm sure people like Madhav Gadkil who spend a lot of time in the field, they're actually speaking for nature. There is a fair amount of work around activism which has happened. So I was just wondering, You have, so, you picked it after 30 years, after 20 years, and, is there something that you can pick on, little more contemporary people who spoke for
No.
nature? Because this ecological grief is something that a lot of people who, have taken
No, I
time
think-
out to sit and do it here. Yeah.
I think both 4 weeks. I think there are many. Harini was talking about what spheres of work can be done. I think there are 2 or 3 things that would be really good. One would be a social history of Indian environmentalism from Chipko till maybe economic liberalization, which spans forest, water, fish, wildlife, looks at not just activism, looks at laws, looks at policies, looks at different governments. Because that is, Chipko is 50 years old. It's history now, right? So I think that's one kind of thing that could be done. In terms of policy, when Madhav and I wrote this Fisher Line, which is really a history, we wrote Ecology and Equity is really a policy book. And I'm quite proud of, actually in some ways I'm more proud of Ecology and Equity than Fisher Line. Because Fisher Line it's original but also very raw and polemical, And recently a publisher wanted to republish either this Fisher Line or Ecology and Equity, and I nudged them towards publishing Ecology and Equity because I think it's more carefully argued. But it's also 30 years out of date. It's it's a programmatic book about policy and politics in the Indian context, but written just as liberalization was starting, right? So I think, maybe biographies. I said I didn't have Salim Ali, but a really good scientific biography of Salim Ali would be fabulous. And I've tried unsuccessfully to persuade 2 or 3 brilliant young ecologists with a serious interest in birds to do it. Because his papers are there in Teen Murti, his diary notes are there, all his writings are there in the, in the BNHS. There have been some good anthologies of his work. Tara Gandhi has produced 3 anthologies of his work. You can still interview his students. You can go to his field sites. You could write really good ecological history of basically landscapes and birds through the life of Salim Ali, right? So I think there is, so I think there are many ways in which the history of environmentalism, Indian environmentalism, there are many areas in which you can have fine, focused work. And mine is just, one small, it's just 10 thinkers whom I happened to stumble upon. So yes, and I said, with Salim Ali, I've tried very hard to, and since I have an interest in biography, I don't understand birds, but I can tell them where to look for the papers and what kind of things to talk about. So, it would be really, and institutional history of the BNHS, right, which is now, including its colonial origins, the controversies around him, what science it spawned. Yeah, there are a lot of possibilities.
So I have a question. So, yeah, it's me.
Yeah.
So I read about Dietrich Brandes, the German forester.
Yeah,
I don't know
yeah.
if I'm pronouncing his name right.
Yeah.
But that got me thinking about how one would, he spoke for tribals, he
Yes.
spoke for the commons, for the tribal commons. And that got me thinking about how one would approach viewing the history of colonial and post-colonial India on the perspective of policy towards nature conservation through colonial and post-colonial India. How a student could approach that?
No, I think you have to break it down. So the Dietrich Brandes you mentioned, I've written about Dietrich Brandes. He was a very interesting man. He was the first Inspector General of Forests, who was German. And when the British, some of you should know this history, when the British decided they needed a forest department, because they were devastating the forests left and right, mostly for their own interest, building the railway network and so on, there was no discipline of forestry in Britain because in 1860s, Britain was the world leader in deforestation, starting with their own island and then going to America and going to the Caribbean. So they invited this German. And the German set up the forest department and said, he said something very visionary. He said, you need one area of forests which are very valuable to the state, species like teak, sal, pine, that will be controlled by the state. But there'll be a secondary area as large, not so valuable commercially or for imperial interests, which should be run by village communities. Because the Germans had municipalities and villages running their own forests. And the British in their arrogance shot it down. And it was only 100 years, more than 100 years later, that in places like Bengal, you had a revival of, in a very modest way, of community forest management, right? So again, the importance of Brandeis, to me, is never paint countries, races in black and white. You know, I mean, this kind of knee-jerk anti-colonial xenophobia that is ubiquitous across India, and not just in the BJP. The Congress Party also practices it. Or intellectuals of the Congress Party also practice it. Let me put it this way. I mean, everyone is, as I said, you know, you can have Gandhi, who's a Bania, deeply concerned about the abolition of untouchability. You can have Nehru, who's a man fighting consistently for universal adult franchise, you know, inspired by the suffragettes. Right? So I think at Brandeis, so you always have these dissenters within. At Brandeis was a very interesting man. And had the colonial state followed his model and constituted village forest committees all over India, the forest would have been in better health, the economy would have been in better health, and you know, and even today. In fact, if you travel to, several years ago, I was in Gadchiroli, where incidentally Madhav Gadgil has also worked, and where there's a vibrant community forestry movement, which has revived the bamboo forests, has revived the water sources, has generated economic benefits to the villagers through forest raw materials, you know, artisanal production. And so, you know, and now the Maharashtra government wants to put a steel mill in Gadchiroli. Who will that help? Right. So I think there are many ways in which we can think through this. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this book. I'm reading it and I'm really enjoying this. So your book is basically to challenge the idea that, largely to challenge the idea that in India cannot have an environmental consciousness because we're too poor.
Yeah.
And there is also this question of, this neo-Malthusian idea that we can't have an environmental consciousness because we're too many. And of course, this has been challenged. So I was just curious about your insights on this aspect, and if you have anything to say about
on the neo-Malthusian aspect.
Yeah, and also like your research, through this book, what insights did you get about that?
No, I think the debate, the neo-Malthusian debate, would actually be slightly different. What they would argue is, and fortunately is now defunct and moribund, but in the 1970s, it was a very important stand in the environmental debate, that poor countries like India and Bangladesh are destined to failure and economic destitution because there are too many people, right? And of course, then you had scholars arguing that it's not absolute numbers of people, but patterns of consumption, and estimates being made that one American consumes as much as 60 Bangladeshis. So America is overpopulated. There was a coda to that estimate, which a Bangladeshi diplomat made after visiting an American supermarket, where he said, an American dog consumes as much as 5 Bangladeshis. Right. So that, fortunately, that argument is gone. It's not that, it's true, population density is a problem. You can't have on the same piece of land too many people. But I think it's more asymmetries in consumption. And in my previous book, which Harini mentioned, how much should a person consume, I kind of argue that. But yes, India is, but the main argument is this, the first part, that it's a fallacy to think India is too poor to be green. And this fallacy is very widespread. It's particularly widespread among, newspapers, columnists, it's also widespread among the political class who wants to duck responsibility for what they're causing. And also the idea, that it's only climate change. And climate change was caused by the West. Yes, the climate change was caused by the West. They are hypocritical. But as I explained, all the environmental problems we face today, as air pollution, depletion of groundwater aquifers, death of rivers, independent of climate change, affect poor people. So I think I think this is something, by the way, one last thing I'd say. The socialist movement, particularly the Marxists, were as ignorant of environmental matters as the capitalists. When I started my research on Chipko 40 years ago, young people here won't know that I was studying in Calcutta in the early 80s and the Berlin Wall was still there. And Calcutta had a communist government and all the intellectuals were Marxists. And they told me, why are you writing on Chipko? It's a bourgeois deviation from the class struggle. And then they explained to me. I mean, I tell you how much ignorance there is on the left and the right. Two old college friends of mine had joined the Communist Party. And I met them after several years, and they said, what are you doing? I said, I'm working on Chipko. He says, but that is reactionary. I said, why? I explained what Chipko was. He says, peasants in the Himalaya are stopping forest felling. They don't want the wood to go to the plywood factory in the plains. I said, yes, because they need the forests and it leads to floods. She said, but the peasants are reactionary. Because if they allow the felling of the trees to go to the plywood factory, that will create the industrial proletariat, and Lenin and Marx told us the industrial proletariat leads the revolution. So what you're working on is reactionary stuff. Right. So there's so much like, this kind of gung-ho modernism, which is still there. And in India, it's actually very much, liberalization. As I said, liberalization was absolutely necessary for many things. But it came with huge hype that if you only open up the market, India will become Singapore writ large. And even environmentalists asked a question, what about that chemical factory? What about that this? They would say, must be a... Now, in those days, they were called KGB agents. Today, they'll be told George Soros is funding them. Right. So this is a kind of a great deal of ignorance. Sometimes it's malevolence. Sometimes it's pure ignorance. Where Malthusianism, where population density comes in, we have higher population densities than Europe and America. Our ecologies are much more fragile, as Harini will tell you. We do not have access to the resources of colonies, which Europe and America had. So, perforce, we have to be more prudent, more responsible, more caring about the environment. I mean, that's where all these thinkers come in.
Sandhya, we need 5 minutes to wrap up. So.
Yeah, I have one question. You said that westernization cannibalizes the ecology.
Western imperialism.
Yeah. Okay, but if you look at the book that you have written, it has a lot of Western influence, the thinkers are mostly Western oriented.
Yeah.
And also, when you look at post-independence, it seems that India has fared worse than maybe British colony, and they have took care of the forest and other ecology much better than what Indians have done over the last 50 years.
Yes.
So how do you see that?
No, I don't dispute that. So there are two or three different things. Because Tagore and Gandhi both argued, Tagore with more clarity than Gandhi, that Western imperialism, the success of the West depended on its control of the resources of the colonies. And because we did not have these colonies, Tagore and Gandhi argued, and the others in my book argued, when we became independent, we had to adopt a more different model of economic development. Less capital, less resources, more centered in the village, and but they were neglected. They were told that we have to catch up with the West. So you could argue that the economic modernizers who are working with Nehru in the 50s, as well as the economic modernizers working with Manmohan Singh and Narendra Modi today, don't understand ecological constraints, don't understand precisely this point. We do not have access to colonies. And what do we do when we do not have access to colonies, but we want to build the same coal plants, the coal steel mills, the same highways, etc.? What happens? We create our own internal colonies. That's why we ravage the Northeast. That's why we ravage Central India. If you just look at what is happening with mining in Central India and what it is doing to the tribal communities there. If you read the writings of a journalist like Chitrangada Chaudhary, for example, you will find this is internal colonialism. To sustain Bangalore and Delhi, we have to loot Chhattisgarh and Orissa and Jharkhand, or Arunachal Pradesh and Bhutan, or China has to loot Africa. That's why the scramble for Africa. Once the Europeans went to Africa, now the Chinese are going. So this is the argument. So essentially you have to live within your means. You have to balance your country's ecological budget, just as you have to balance your family's domestic budget.
Harini, one more question? Last one?
You tell us, sir. You're the one who was
Sure. On this side.
Last question. Yeah.
Hi, good evening. You spoke about how a couple of decades ago, how environmental studies was not part of the curriculum. And even though today it is, the pedagogy is limited to very theoretical classroom series. In which ways do you think the pedagogy could change or could be improved to to either like connect children to nature or something, because it's still very disconnected in terms of
I
even
think,
if it's
I'd like Harini to answer that question because she, I sit alone in my study and have done so more or less for 30 years. So, is that
I don't want to take too much time. We can talk later because the discussion is about the book. But I think we need to be engaging more with varieties of things. I mean, for instance, just to take from this book, if you look at a lot of the people, you look at Tagore, look at his paintings, but also look at his art, look at his poetry. I think we need to get beyond just the text. And there's a lot of that reflection here. So I think that's one of the most powerful ways to connect is not just through the verbal word and the classroom discussion, but to take that into other forms of embodied practice. So with that, I think, a lot of people have been asking you, where is the thread? What is the connection? And I see your point. One of the things that strikes me in a lot of these discussions, and especially I started thinking about it when I was looking at Radhakamal Mukerjee and the Commons, but also Verrier Elwin talking about a specific tribe, Baigas, in a specific area. One of the biggest problems in the way we treat ecology and ecological management, I mean, for climate change mitigation is going to be by planting trees. There's nothing local, there's nothing bioregional. Even Patrick Geddes is saying what you do in Pune is not what you do in Hyderabad, is not what you do in Tanjavur, right? So there is so much attention that doesn't mean anything goes. Everything is local, there are no principles. But they're all talking about principles and processes, but then the adaptation has to be to the local, and the local includes the people, not just the ecology. People are part of the ecology. Right? So I think that's very profound to me, a way forward for us, and we should be thinking about these. And like I said, so again, for the young people in the audience, I think this is an invitation for many people to go out now and look at many more of these thinkers around us, contemporary as well as older, and discover many more paths that can. So that's where I'll wrap up, but I want to ask you, what are your thoughts?
No, I think, what you said about the local and the bioregional and looking at specific socio-ecological context and what is conceivable there, what is manageable there. Again, if I may just say, one of the things that Madhav Gadgil used to argue is that decentralization is, thoroughgoing political decentralization is really very good for natural resource management. So, in Karnataka, in the early 90s, there was a brief period for about 4 years when there was proper Panchayati Raj. When, today you have Panchayati Raj, which is only elections. So you have an election where you have 30% women and so on and so forth. But the Panchayats had no powers, no legal powers, no powers to gather money, no powers to frame policy. And in those 4 or 5 years, under the Janta government, Ramakrishna Hegde's Janta government, you had proper decentralization, and he found that when the villagers had the power, the water resources, the pasture, the community forests were much better managed. If a polluting industry came, they had the power to stop it, or at least say, clean your effluents, or at least say, okay, if you're setting up an industry, how about giving 25% of the jobs to this community, right? So there's even a distribution of economic benefits. Now, Madhav has continued like that, what he's doing in Gadchiroli with community forest management, or at Goa. One of the rare field trips I made at Madhav's instance, because I'm not really much of a field worker, was to Goa, where he was working with promoting cooperative mining, saying instead of giving the mine to some big industrialist in Bombay or Gujarat, the villager will mine with scientific advice. And if mining is in the control of the local village, if there's a hill with ore, then they will make sure that it's done carefully, that there's no runoff onto the fields, into the water sources. So I think, in many ways, I think political decentralization, even maybe city management, and you have written on Bangalore, so you would know, would empowering municipalities lead to more pressure from citizens, more powers to an elected city administration to, manage transport.
Ward committees, which everyone's been asking for.
All of that. So I think that is something when it's all centralized in the Vidhan Saudha or in the parliament, then that is the problem. Because,
Thank you very much, and I think the books are available, and Ram is hopefully here to sign the books. Thank you very much.